All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Well, I hope you are back. If you have been watching all of my videos, awesome. Thank yous. Kudos to you because I know they can be a little lot and daunting. And I'm not always clear. Makes sense. But that's who I am as a teacher. I mean, that's who I am as a presenter. That's who I am as a person. Um, so if it's been a little rough or hard to follow, I apologize about that. Hopefully, this will be my shortest video. I say that every time I hit record, and it never really happens by any means. But I did have to present this in class. This was my final class presentation that I did in April of 2023. So right around the end of the semester, and we only had 15 minutes to present. Um, I don't think I made the 15 minutes, to be quite honest with you. I think I was closer to 20. I was very lucky that this professor didn't just cut me off and was like, okay, your 15 minutes is done. So this was a very, very fast introduction of what it is that I'm trying to do. So also for that class, I did have to write a little bit of a conference paper. I think mine turned out to be about 18 pages. But I'm going to revamp it and revise it and keep working on it because it is going to become my prospectus. So it does have a little bit of what I want to do my dissertation about. It does have a little bit of how my chapters are going to be structured. And if you've been watching the other 4 videos, then you will know kind of what those chapters are going to be, right? About literary eugenics, what genres we're focusing on and why. And then I've gone over how to give an example of that. So horror genre, we have zombies and how it impacts women. In And then I also mentioned like mystery. And then I also mentioned plague. And then in plague literature, we do have the example of Jack London and his work in the Scarlet Plague, as well as his other many works. And then in pop culture, then we went over Batman and Encanto and how we can kind of see that in a little bit more family structure. So this video is gonna be like how we get rid of it, right? There's no use talking about this is the problem, this is the issue that we are facing, if there isn't a way to solve it. So this is what I have been thinking about. This is what I would continue to dive into on how can we resolve literary eugenics and what it has done to yeah, our education system as a whole, what it has done to our country, what it has done to other countries, because not only do we have the issue here in the US, but also in Canada, also in Australia, New Zealand, parts of Mexico still, and other parts of Latin America. So I mean, this is a pedagogy that I'm like, let's keep recreating it. And I know my limitations as well. I am focusing on who I am as an individual. I'm focusing on what I can talk about, but I would love for eventually someone else to take this and say, this is how I can apply it to my culture. This is how I can apply it to, who I am as a person, my self narratives and things like that. um, so again, I'm like, this is already getting longer than what I wanted, but I'm gonna share with you my screen, and this is what I'm starting with. Brown Misfit Pedagogy. So let me get over to the slideshows. Just play this. Because usually when I have PowerPoint, just like my regular PowerPoint, like I just hit start slideshow. Okay, there it is. Hello, Demini. So again, this is all of my information. I'm always welcome for comments, feedbacks, questions, concerns. So this is what I have so far: Brown Misfit Pedagogy. Um, and so this is my very brief thought on how we're going to construct this. So the project goals, or paper goals, of what we're looking at is, I'm looking at self narratives, right? Specifically in Chicana framework, in the Chicana feminist framework, of self narratives, of self stories, testimonials, and storytelling in general, and how that's been impacted with what I've called literary eugenics. And this is also to address how teachers and some of their pedagogy has either impacted or can help improve, with literary eugenics and self narratives and storytelling. So again, if you've been following along with my series, you already know what I classify literary eugenics are, but I will also give just a very brief kind of background here. So eugenics was started as the belief and techniques to basically remove racial and I'm like, I'm going to start over because I was like partly reading and going over this a little bit. So it started with origins of the species, survival of the fittest, evolution, right? It takes millions and millions of years before we can come to, what we see now, as far as that, and everything goes into evolution between your environment, what you're learning, as well as your genes, and who you mate with, producing the species more and more and more. um After Darwin came out with that, his cousin Sir Francis Galton did come out with this technique of eugenics that said, we are going to speed up evolution, and we are going to speed up evolution by taking out anything that is undesirable from the gene pool. And of course, undesirable traits and undesirable gene pools have went through everything. It went to everything from mental illness, to diminished mental faculties, um, anybody that had a mental or physical disability, anybody who was, deemed unworthy, prisoners, anybody convicted of a crime, anybody who had certain racial features, historically, like anybody who was Afro or Black American, because I'm focusing specifically on the U.S., anybody who was Indigenous or Native American, anybody who could have been, Jewish. We've talked about all of that in my past videos. So these were techniques that were used on people. They were forced sterilizations, forced institutionalized lobotomies. We can go on that and how women were treated. People were put in prison falsely. We have lynching that is a part of this eugenic framework. We have forced marriages that are also a part of this. Well, eventually we get to a point where we say we can't physically do this to people. And there's been many studies of how eugenics has impacted our culture, right? Everything from the food industry, certain cereals that we have, came out of the eugenic mindset. Even certain pedagogy, certain ways that we run prisons, construct prisons, the, you know, school to prison pipeline, again, was influenced by eugenics. Planned Parenthood was influenced by eugenics. So there's all parts of politics and everything that's been examined on how eugenics has caused that impact. My study and research focuses on how eugenic beliefs and techniques have influenced storytelling, mainly how it has impacted our literature, on what we write, what we think about, and where we're going with this. One of the authors I'm going to be focusing on is The Dark Fantastic. I should have had her name, but it's Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, who wrote The Dark Fantastic. I was saying that much of our imagination nowadays is, well, she doesn't exactly say influenced by eugenics, but I mean that's the process, right? We can't even think in different colors, to the point where even if a writer clearly states like there's a certain race or a certain gender that characters are supposed to be, certain disabilities that they have are getting weeded out. One of the ones focused on is like Harry Potter. Many of Harmony's traits, many have said have been related to, you know, being part of, you know, African or Black descent. And we can't even think of Harmony in that way because we're like, no, she's the heroine. Another one would be the Hunger Games as well. Many were upset that Rue, even though written by the written by the author to be, you know, a Black individual, many people were still upset about that. There have been research in trying to prove that Katniss Everdeen is not a white woman, but actually an Indigenous woman. Everything from her name to what she was taught by her father, um, you know, shows that she and her family are Indigenous people. If you have read the books or watched the films, that's one of the criticisms, that it is supposed to be the 13 original colonies. um where are the Indigenous people in this? So I'm looking at that. How has it impacted our storytelling, and how has it impacted our narrative framework, and how is it and how that impacts our self narrative and our self reflection a little bit. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing. Had a Needed a quick break there. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. Surprise, surprise. So I'm breaking down. So now that I've gone over what the project goal is, what the ideas of what I'm researching and focusing on, I'm now going to break down where I came up with the name rhetorically. So Brown, the Brown Misfit Pedagogy. So Brown comes from Jose Munoz. He used this term in the Brown Commons. You know, Cruising Utopia. He used it in Disidentifications. And this is what he calls, like, he doesn't use brown as a particular like this is a race, this is a culture or anything. He says brown is like a sense of being, of who you are. Um you know, it's a feeling, it's a being part of family and community and culture. And the thing is that there's so many different terms, there's so many different aspects of what that can entail, is that he's saying that we can't fit everything in here, right? So some of the things I focus on, like Hispanic was originally came from the Latin root word Hispania, which is for Spain. Then we have words like Chicano, and where that came from, Chicanismo, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous. All of these have different communities, different pieces of information, different backgrounds that come with it. But he says you put any of these folks and culture and customs together, you are going to get a brown commons. You are going to get basically like a low common denominator of where we are in that sense. And so that's what he calls brown and brownness. And so that's where I've taken that term to kind of replace all of this other stuff that comes with the historical significance behind it. You know, this is a specifically for the Brown Commons. But like I said, I'm hoping that it would be taken into to other arenas as well. But I do know my limitations. There's certain things that I might not be able to talk about, that I'm leaving open for other folks to kind of pick up on that. The other term that I'm using, misfit, so Brown Misfit Pedagogy. Misfit comes from Rosemary Garland Thompson, and she wrote an essay explaining why she wants this word to replace disabled, unabled, you know, differently abled and things like that. One, because she does not believe anybody is disabled. It doesn't matter how you were born, doesn't matter what happened to you, doesn't matter what your stories or what you look like, or anything like that. you are not a disabled person. To say anybody is disabled is to point to someone who is abled, who is the idea, right? Like, this is the idea that we want, and this is the idea that you are not. She says none of that should exist. All right. Nobody's disabled, nobody's unable. We just misfit. Right. So the same way that Jose Munoz is like, we have a brownness, we have a sense of what's in common. Rosemary Garland is saying the same thing. Right. In certain spaces, we misfit. Certain places, in certain areas, in certain, even academia, we can misfit that space. Right. There is always a sense of misfitting when I can't do something. One of the examples that she gives is like, what if there was a building and the only way to get into this building is through stairs? Like, the stairs are all the way around this building. There is absolutely no elevators, no escalators, no no on-ramps to get up there. She's like, you are not disabled, you are not unabled, you misfit that space because the person who created that space did not have you in mind. And that sense of misfitting is like a Brown Commons, right? It doesn't matter if you have a disease, chronic illness, whether you have a physical limitation. We all have a sense of misfitting in one sense or another, and that's what she is trying to kind of take on, right? And the example that I have here, if you can see the picture here, it's one of those little balls that children use, and they take like the stars, and they take the triangles, and they take the circles, and they try to put them into this little ball, and it's to teach children shapes. What's a triangle, what's this? And she says what happens is we teach children this, right? You can be a square, you can be a triangle, you can be a trapeze, you can be whatever the hell you want. But in order to get into this building, in order to get into this space, particularly academia, now you have to fit yourself into a certain piece that might be behind the ball, might be under the ball, might be on top of the ball, or you have to fit yourself into a space that was not created for you, right? So if you're the star, yeah, you can get in by being pushed through the X, or being pushed through the square, or being turned a little bit to get through the triangle, but that was not particularly made for you in mind. You have to create something in order to get in there. And this is not part of her example. This is mine. This is what I use in order to better explain. Because I do like images. I do like all of that. When trying to work with, especially with terms, that we're creating new terms and everything. So that's what I'm trying to capitalize here, particularly in pedagogy, in early education, public education, and things like that. Sometimes we misfit the space, not only as someone in the disability side of it, but someone who's also part of the Brown Commons. Now, if anybody's read Kimberly Crenshaw's essay in the Stanford Law Review about intersections, that's also going to come into play here as well. So sometimes this misfitting isn't just about being disabled, it's also about being a certain race, it's about being a certain gender, it's about being queer, who's overtly queer, who's covertly, queer, and all of this other stuff can be taken into account. Yet despite all of this, right, despite us saying we're going to look at a feminist framework, we're going to look at a disability framework, we're going to look at critical race framework, all of us can say at one point or another, we have felt a sense of misfitting a space, right? So Brown misfit pedagogy, right, is designed exactly for that, the Brown Commons and for the misfits and any of the intersections that are in between. And I'm going to move forward. That stopped. So why is it important? Okay, why is this important for us to stop and say, why do we need to look at early schooling? Why do we need to look at public schools? Why do we need to look at academia in general? Well, oftentimes our first encounter of otherness either being misfits or being a part of the Brown Commons is through school and academia. So I looked through Stephanie Fettis' book, Shaming into Brown, where she talks about exactly that, where she has always been part of her Brown Commons with her family, with her friends, with her community. And the first time that she ever encounters a white person is when she's at school, which is what school is designed for, particularly public school. It's designed that everybody is there, has a free education. And while she makes several different friends, she also learns that these friends are like, these other people know things of like are already like assuming things about her because this is what their family tells them, right? Oh, she's an immigrant, she could be illegal, she could be dumb, you don't want to associate with people like that. And from such an early age of just being in kindergarten, she learns a sense of shame that she did not have prior to that, to the point where we can almost say, well, if you were taken outside of school and academia, would you have had the same sense of shaming? Now homeschooling or other schooling is not often part that people can participate in, which is why it is we need to focus on the public schools and how we can change that. Um, one person that I would particularly mention is Benita Love and her work in We Want to Do More Than Just Survive in her abolition pedagogy, where she says being a teacher and being a good teacher and a teacher that's wanting to help all of their students is about being in the political arena. You have to be political about it. That means you got to be protesting Washington, you got to be wanting all of that out of your classroom. Any of the you can't teach this or you can't say this or you can't do that. Our job isn't to our job isn't to draw conclusions for our students. It is to give our students the means and ammunition to find what they're looking for, right? I'm not here to preach to you. I'm here to show you how we can find this. And I'm here to show you several different points of view. Okay. Often, and then another reason that I'm looking at school and academia in particular for this project is often misfitting is mislabeled. So already with students that have intersections with queer identity, that can be mislabeled in academia, right? Like you don't have a learning disability, you talk with that lisp or you talk with that because you're queer. You like there's this gay voice, particularly with males that's always mentioned. Like that's why you talk like that. It's not that you have an issue that needs to be addressed by the school, it's just that you're gay. Or racial identity, right? Oh, you don't have a learning disability. You just spoke Spanish the first part of your life. You're just catching up. Like there's so many different things that hinder students with intersections, right? And things of that nature. So it's also trying to say if we remove that and just go with the misfitting, right? And still trying to provide students. I'm a firm believer. I'm like, we should not be needing accommodations. Like nobody should be fighting for accommodations. Accommodations should be readily provided. This idea that students cannot read off their computers, it's got to be a book, this idea that audiobooks are not really books and you have to get an accommodation in order to use an audiobook for class or in order to use an audiobook at home, or you can't use an electronic dictionary or a dictionary in general. Like I'm just a part of the believer that we need to remove that from the disability framework, which is what would really help with removing this mislabeling of our identities and mythism. Okay, so a part of my paper started as a response to Parker J. Palmer, The Courage to Teach, so to speak, because I do model this paper probably a little bit differently. I'm going to move this over here, and apologies to anybody who might have found this book to be very helpful or to the author himself, but Excuse me. Um, but when I was reading this book, I was asking the questions, if Parker J. Palmer had me as a student and with some of the issues that I faced in academia, is part of some of the overt racism and gender discrimination that I previously experienced, um, would he be able to teach to me? He seems to be under an understanding that there's that while teachers do face a certain issues, one of the biggest things we face is getting older. We don't know all of their terminologies. We don't know all of their technologies. We don't know these new students the way that we used to. Um, and I'm like, that's not the only thing that the teachers are facing. And that was would have been my next question to him of me I mean, obviously when I walk into a classroom, like it's written on my face on who I am. What would you say to a teacher that is having these type of microaggressions or overt racism from classmates or parents? How would you want them to, like, how would they also use this as a tool and a framework in order for that? So because I found these lacking, that's what I wanted to respond to. That's what I wanted to particularly focus on in my project and say, this is where I'm making it a priority, and this is what we can do inside of this pedagogy framework. Other pedagogists that I look at and that I do use commonly throughout this particular, like I do mention somewhere within this particular section, but there's many others that I'm looking at. This list has kind of grown, it's kind of expanded. It's also my own personal story as well. So, my own self narrative on how I have been as a teacher. But I do want to say a little bit about each one of them. During the presentation, I couldn't. I was like, I can only tell you what I'm looking at, and then I gotta like rush out of here. But that's the beauty of video. So I can go through and say, what am I looking at? So Bell Hooks was a particular pedagogist that I honed to like my very first time when I realized this is what I want to do. And she said something in her book, Teaching to Transgress, that just that's made it into every single part of my syllabus, my pedagogy, philosophical statements and otherwise. She says, never ask a student to do something that either you haven't done or you are not willing to do yourself. It sounds so simple, and yet it is so very difficult. Um, Teachers, like parents, do often want their students to do something that they might not be able to do for some type of limitation, like misfitting and disability, or I mean, they want them to do something that they are not maturely enough to do. So anytime that I particularly work in my classes, I always tell them I have either done this work or I'm willing to do this work. I'm always willing to share with you my thoughts. I'm always willing to share with you how I would answer it. I'm always willing to stand up and kind of be an idiot. Like, I'm not going to ask you to present something that I wouldn't present. I'm not going to ask you to look at something that I haven't read. Um, which is like I said, it sounds like a very simple thing, and if more teachers did it, we might have a little bit more like teacher student relationship that isn't like, as much as we can think about a teacher that we loved, we can absolutely remember a teacher that we absolutely hated. There's so many TikToks about like bad teachers, or like what people have experienced or what a teacher has told a student, or like the teachers that seem to single students out for no particular reason, other than just a bias or something, or hearing a story from another teacher and just bringing that into their classroom. So that is a statement that has always made it in there, and that's why bell hooks is at the top. Laura Rendon, in her book Sempre Presente, brings up a technique that she calls sitting at the kitchen table, which means that she walks into a classroom not as a classroom, but she sees it more as her kitchen table. And she says, because of her sense of brownness, right, her brown comments, She says, we get our experiences, we get our knowledge from sitting down with our comadres and our compadres, with sitting down with our elders, our abuelas and abuelitos, and our tias and tios, and listening to them, usually over coffee and bread, right? Usually over coffee and some pan de dulce, of what it is that they like, what have they thought, what have they experienced, um, different things. Like, this is how we learn in an environment that is very, um I feel like I want to say neutral, but I'm not quite sure that's exactly it. But when you walk into a classroom already having desks and already having certain posters and already certain paint on the walls, it just it feels like an institution, right? It's either like mental hospital feel, horror movie-ish, or this is a prison type thing. And so she wants to approach her classroom as this is a place where we can sit down and we can conversate and we can learn that way through each other. Um, so I am formulating a technique that is something very similar to that, but a little bit more something that I can relate to myself. We've already gone over Benita Love and her abolition pedagogy. I mean, absolutely, like, teachers need to be fighting for their rights. They need to be unionized, just like, construction workers and nurses and everyone else. We do need teachers. We do need people that are fighting for our teachers and what they can and cannot teach. We do need to have the ability to have alternative schools, whether that be Catholic schools, charter schools, even indigenous schools. So in certain states, like, you can't open certain types of schools. Like, you can't say, I'm going to open up a school that's focused specifically on indigenous pedagogies and indigenous ways of being. Because it might be seen as something that could be breaking the law. So she's another one that's absolutely there. The only thing I would ask is, how can we prevent not getting fired? Because if we do have, hundreds of teachers that are storming the capitals and saying this is what they're unhappy about, how can we prevent them from just being fired? Like, how can we prevent them from having admin that's going to ride them because they're like, you're a troublemaker because you keep raising awareness about things. I was at a school where they were like, we're teaching, about Holland and Dutch Jesus, not Dutch Santa Claus, this the Santa Claus story, and it goes in the shoe and everything. And I'm like, but if you read or if you go back and research their Santa Claus, Santa Claus doesn't have elves. Santa Claus has children slaves from Africa that were kidnapped. So it's a very different story. I did live in a Dutch town up in Iowa that did often have a parade where people would go around in blackface, pretending to be the elves when Santa Claus kind of came to town. Um, so I was like taking that experience and what I knew and saying, I don't want to teach this to children because they're going to assume that every Santa Claus or every story that another culture has is a positive, and it's not always the case. Um, of course, like, admin and everybody else is like, well, I mean, they're kids, like, we're not going to tell them that, but like, we can't just hide and cover up the story. So that would be something that I would raise and be like, how do we address that? Because if everybody gets fired, it's like, who's taking care of the kids then? And okay, so then we have Ibram Kendi and his framework of how not to be an anti-racist. um I've read that book several times, cover to cover. um I still feel like this is things that this should just be innate. We should just know this, and the fact that certain people don't is just surprising to me all the time. Like, uh like, I'm like, we need to be going into the colleges and saying, okay, education department, like this is what you need to be. You need like all of your teachers need to open this book and just read it. Um, you know, I for one think the teachers should have an ethics the same way that counselors and doctors have an ethics and an ethics committee. So if you think a doctor has violated an ethics code, I mean, you can go to the board. The same thing with a therapist and counselors. Anybody who has a license, so to speak, has a board that oversees ethics and makes sure that they are maintaining that. I believe teachers should have the same type of function because while you know how to teach math or you know how to teach reading or you know how to teach this, oftentimes they often know how to control certain populations. They know how to kind of ridicule kids without, and then gaslighting them. So I'm like, we need an ethics board for teachers. And Ibram Kendi is like the prime reason, like why I'm like, I feel this way. The fact that certain teachers don't even have this basic framework of how not to be like how not to be fucking racist is still surprising to me. Um, and then we have Pablo Fiore, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So he does talk about how the elitism and how the difference between classes can also play an issue into the classroom as well and how to keep that out. I will tell you, I need to go back and reread that a few more times because he has many different like if you read it through once and you're like, I understood it, I don't never need to open this again. I never need to look at my notes. You didn't you didn't read it well, or you have an ability far exceeds a past mind. So um I am going to be bringing some of that into play. This Marxism, classism, that is mentioned in Pedagogy of the Oppressed as well. Although I would say I'm not as well versed as it is, but as I am with the other ones. Sean Wilson, in his research is ceremony. So he gets into the pedagogical framework that everything teachers do, everything professors do is ceremony, like an indigenous ceremony, the same way that um us indigenous folks have our ceremonies and what we keep sacred. And the reason that we do certain things is because it's not just a connection to ourselves and to our culture and to our family, but a connection to the divinity that we have. And so he says that in a classroom or teaching about research or teaching about anything, um, also comes with this sense of ceremony that teachers need to be aware that when they're doing this, they're not just doing it for themselves or for the children or for their paychecks, but they're doing it quite literally as a divine representation, as a way to be spiritual. It's like an act of going to church, which is beautiful. Um, and of course, he has a way of how, if you are a student as well, how you can bring into your own research an indigenous paradigm and framework, and how you can basically work through the red tape, because sometimes depending on the departments, like they're very strict about what your research paradigms and frameworks are going to be. Sometimes they give it to you, and so he found a way to say this is how you can do it and still show academia that you are basically following the rules. So that you yourself as a student are not getting in trouble or being kicked out or failing papers because you've tried to implement this type of framework. So I would definitely recognize that. And then Andrea Riley Molkovitz as well. She's also an Indigenous scholar. Now she looks at self narratives and looking at how these self narratives can be used as a teaching guideline as well. So we're not just teaching what happened in the 1800s. We're not just teaching what happened in 1775. We're not teaching any of that. We're also using ourselves and our experience as part of the way that we can educate students and how we can use that. So what I really particularly like about both of them, about Wilson and Riley Moskovitz, is I don't even know if I'm saying her last name correctly, is is the way that they write. They write in a way that is not that is not old school academic whatsoever. It's not third person omniscient with perfect grammar and rhetoric. At times, Wilson will write about teaching and write about research to, to his children. He's like, I'm going to like, this is how I would tell it to my children. This is how I would teach it to my children. The same thing with Riley Muscovitz and how she's saying this is how I would have this conversation with my grandmother, and everything that she writes in academia, despite it having an audience and a professor and your PhD boards and everything. She also wants to have language in there that she would address to her grandmother, as if they were sitting over a kitchen table and having a conversation about her work. So it's a very beautiful, different way of writing, um, that I would like to implement more and more, especially around the Chicana framework narrative of anything that we do is political, and how I myself and what I'm doing is also political. So both of these have been, while they've been a recent development and inspiration, then like they have to make the list. And like I said, there will be many, many more pedagogists. If you can recommend somebody or a book, I'm all open for it. I'll read it, I'll look through it. Let's see how we can work this together. Right, this is a living pedagogy. Anybody who says that their pedagogy is fixed and final is a liar. They're right. Generations change, language changes, what we look at changes. Because consent was often one that we did not teach, we did not focus on, we did not look to whatsoever, and now it has become a topic of conversation. So this is a living pedagogy. I am not going to like the way I start now might not be how I would represent this in 30 years or 50 years or even 100 years from now. I want it to change, and I want it to adapt to new generations. I don't want it to be so finalized that it can't be retaught. It can only exist in this time, in this space. No, not at all. um or the same, like, because it's a living pedagogy, if you feel you can do this, with your own community, with an Asian community, or an African community or Jamaican community, like, please, like pull it, do it. This is a living pedagogy that allows you to do that, to map it to your frameworks. Those are my limitations. I know that's not my story to tell. um but definitely, let's see how we can collaborate to work together to make this pedagogy something that we can continue to move forward and move forward, to break the cycle, so to speak. This is probably longer than what I was anticipating, but we are now getting to the conclusion, to my presentation, that I had. Brown Misfit Pedagogy, like I said, is still a work in progress. It's a living pedagogy that will change to the needs of the students, and we don't know what those needs are just yet. Um, but if anything does arise, I want this to be able to combat that as well, because technology was something that when most traditional pedagogy was being created, we didn't have. When cell phones became something that you can put in your pocket, I remember teachers telling me you need to learn how to multiply and divide and add, because you're not going to be able to walk around the grocery store with a calculator. You're not going to be able to live with a calculator in your hand. And now every phone, every computer, everything has a calculator. Everything has a way for me to do it without having to know math. Um, the way students use technology to cheat, on tests and things like that was not something that we had, um, with certain pedagogies, for certain frameworks, certain techniques. And that's what I'm trying to say. If something does arise like that, this needs to be a living, breathing pedagogy, that can allow for changes. Because if not, your pedagogy is going to die out like everything else. Like it's just going to be taught as a history. This isn't meant to be a history. This is meant to be used, and this is meant to be helpful in everyday life. And while I probably did not touch anywhere in this conversation about the self narrative talk, the main focus, of course, at the end of all of this is to look at that. How our storytelling, how our modern storytelling, through being influenced by eugenics, creates a sense of identity for certain students, especially students that are in that culture. For example, like Little House on the Prairie. How does that storytelling technique that's under a certain belief and mindset impact the sense of identity for students that could be that are indigenous, that are in the classroom having to read this? And this was something that was focused on with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, when schools were said we can segregate finally. They were like, we're going to smash that down. The Oh my God, I just blanked out on their names, but it was a husband and wife team. They did the dolls to show the sense of identity and what segregation was doing to children in schools, which is what swayed the the Supreme Court to vote the way that they did. Um, and and that's what I'm saying, is that even though we might not have anything that is overt as it might have been back then in the 50s or the 60s, well, we don't have students that are being beaten, because that was something that happened quite often in South Texas. If you spoke Spanish anywhere in school, you could be sent to the principal's office to be paddled and whipped. Well, we don't have that as often, because corporate punishment still exists in public schools in several different states. Um, I don't think many school districts use it because it's more of a PR nightmare than anything else. But many of the laws haven't even changed for that, because the laws move slowly. The sense of identity and how we compose ourselves. How do you know who you are if you're always being told you are something negative? Um, how do you have this sense of telling people your self narrative when it's constantly different than what we have been told and what we have been portrayed as in not just books. I know I'm focusing on literature, but I do also include film and other adaptations of art as part of that. So that's the main overall reason for this, is this sense of identity in ourself, narrating ourself, our own making of self identity, is really being touched by many of the storytellings that still have these eugenic beliefs, techniques, and mindsets. And unfortunately, teachers are the ones that are teaching it. And while they may not be aware that these beliefs and techniques and these mindsets are still existing or still present into the text, students, like Stephanie Feta was saying, are still experiencing this deep sense of shame out of it. And that's what this pedagogy is meant to combat. We don't want students to feel a sense of shame. We want students to develop their identities and develop their self-narrating, not only for themselves, but for their communities. And it's important to academia because it brings to a different perspective that wasn't there already. And academia spaces should be there to embrace any part of this identity and any part of this change and looking into. And this probably went on longer than I would have liked or you would have liked, but this is my conclusion. This is what I'm doing. Like I said, the paper I wrote for this class is going to be used as my prospectus. So it is just going to be a basic introduction to the project, what I'm doing, and why I'm doing it, what kind of chapters I would have had in a book or anything. And again, questions, comments, feedback, This is a living, breathing pedagogy, and anything that you provide as far as pedagogies to look at or techniques inside certain classrooms, by all means, please reach out to me, let me know, leave a comment. I'd be more than happy to see how we can work in collaboration. And while this is the last video for now, because I've now caught up to everything that I'm doing in 2023, I'm hoping next summer I can sit down as well and also keep you updated on the progress that I've done in this fall and upcoming fall and spring academic years, you know. All right. Well, I hope you have a good one. Bye.